You know, I'm a woman, and church has been mean to women, etc. I'm a gay lesbian myself. I'm a person. The church has always been mad to gay people, etc. No, they're not mad at us. We don't. We don't matter. They don't even see us. When there's a big church, downtown Atlanta, Peachtree Street, one of our churches, and I'm communicating with them on a regular basis. And I'm talking to these young adults who are going by on a Sunday morning, and I literally have stopped some of them and said, excuse me, I'm sorry to bother you while you're running, but has it ever occurred to you to come worship at this church? And their first question back to me is, what church? I'm like, it's a church. It's a whole block and a half of church. It's like right there. They're like, oh, across from the Starbucks. Which is really St. Arbuck's. And they're like, oh. So they know St. Arbuck's. They don't know church. They don't even see us. They're not mad about us. We are just completely irrelevant. So how we communicate, back to Chris's question, the gospel is going to be first and foremost through relationship. We've got to build relationships. The formula, if there is one, seems to be a meet away from home. I was in Fort Worth, Texas. Fort Worth, Texas, there's this big, huge Presbyterian church on a hill. There's a nice condo development right nearby, across the street, goes down this hill. Downtown's right there. Condos are packed with 20, 30-somethings. And First Pres Fort Worth is on the hill. It's a huge church, a couple thousand members, tons of money, etc. They called an associate pastor for young adult ministry. I told them, you have to get him or her, whoever you call, you have to buy them a condo. So they called the young woman, and she's living in a condominium in the condo complex. Where do they meet? They meet at the clubhouse for the condominium. And she's got easily 55 to 60 young adults on Sunday evenings in worship and Thursday nights in Bible study. The pastors of the First Presbyterian Church of Fort Worth, 20 yards up the hill, are like, we're right here. They begged her, just try, just meet here. Because we don't want to have to keep on paying to rent this clubhouse. Just try meet here. So she did. Attendance plummeted. They're yearning for community, but they're very clear about community on their terms. So I was in this conversation and talking about this, and one of my really, really uppity seminary students said, well, Rodger, why does that surprise you? Like what? It just sounds like whose ministry? It sounds like Jesus' ministry. I'm like, what? And she said, well, it isn't like he said, yo, I'm in Nazareth, come, sit at my feet. What did he do? Walked around. You, little short man in the tree, no one seems to like you. I'm going to your home today to have dinner, and you're going to be converted, and you're going to repair the damage you've done to relationships throughout this whole community. I mean, that's what he did. I hate it when my seminary students know more than I do. It is so threatening to my ego. But bam, she's on it. She said, this is the ministry Jesus is calling us to. Jesus didn't say, okay, we're here, come, just sit at us, just be like us. Jesus left and went out. I think that's the model for us, Chris. Go where they are and be with them. Relationship stuff. I teach a class on group building theory and faith development. Group building theory, people who have talked about groupness, they define groupness, and they've quantified it. They say it takes 17 hours for a group to be a group. A minimum of 17 contact hours for a group to be a group. You don't get groupness until you're past the 17th hour, okay? Groupness is defined as three things. People share a common purpose. I can separate out everyone in the group and I can ask them, why do you guys exist? And they're going to say something similar. common purpose, they have a common history, they can tell stories about each other, they know some things about each other, they've done some things and built a history together, and they're resilient. They're able to endure conflict. They don't just disperse after conflict, they actually stick with one another. Those are the three things for groupness. You know, you have a group when people have a common sense of purpose, people have some sense of what it means to live with one another, even in the midst of controversy, and people have this sense of history. They have stories with one another. Group building theorists say it takes 17 hours for the group to be a group. They say that that 17 hours has to be continuous, not contiguous. So it doesn't have to be 17 hours in a row, but it's a 17 hours cumulatively. The problem is, in group building theory, it has to be the same people for those 17 hours. As soon as somebody drops out after hour 2, you have a new group. That person comes back in hour 7, you have a new group. Continuous, not contiguous, okay? So I've told my students, I'm teaching my students, I'm saying you have to work like crazy, Chris, to get 17 hours. How do you get 17 hours of people being together? Retreat. Nicely done. A retreat can do it. What else? What did you say? Incarceration. Which we're trying in this country, by the way. Thank you. How else? Nice. A work project, mission trip, etc. I've got one of my young adults, Injin Lee, who's phenomenal. John Injin Lee. He's taking his group of 5 to Costa Rica for 4 days. He said, I'm getting 17 hours, okay? And I said, I totally get it. He's counting on the group of 5 to be a core, so when they come back, they will be his solid core. And group building theory says, once you get that groupness, it's like bugs drawn to a light. People are so desperate for belonging, they're going to be drawn to this. The funny thing about groupness is I've watched this and I've heard this, is people after a while who weren't even participants in the original group begin to talk like they were. Remember when we were on the mission trip and we did this and this and this to Rodger? Wasn't that fun? Yeah, but you weren't there. I know, but I've heard the story so many times, it feels like I was. And that's how groupness spreads, okay? So I tell people the tough part about this generation is they're institution ignorers. We have to appear as uninstitutional as possible. We're looking for 17 hours. That's the formula. It's actually increased. It used to be 14 about 12 years ago in group building theory. Now it's 17 hours. It's taking longer to get to that groupness. I contend that that's the same thing about committees and boards and agencies. You don't trust each other until you've been together for 17 hours. So I've got a group of young adults, or high schoolers, or middle schoolers, and mom says, oh, but Kyle's got a soccer thing, so I can drop him off Saturday morning and then pick him up and then bring him back. What's my problem? He's going to mess up my groupness. And instead of sounding capricious like I hate Kyle, I actually tell her, I'm sorry, that's not going to work. Well, why not? And I tell her why. I tell her, well, because I was in this class at seminary, and this guy who's my professor talked about groupness, and it takes 17 hours, and if Kyle leaves, we lose all the hours up to that point. We haven't got 17 yet. When he comes back, we're back at hour 1, okay? And she's like, what? But at least she understands that you're not just being mean to Kyle, that you're really trying to get something going here. Because this is going to sustain you for about 4 months. And then group building theory says some other groupness event has to happen. It sustains for about 4 months. And the group begins to dissipate, and you go for 17 more hours and some other thing. For us, typically in church calendar, that means I tell my young people, I teach a course on youth ministry, you'll launch something in August, right? With some kind of a overnight something, a lock-in or whatever. That sustains you through December. In January, hit them again with another event. 17-hour event, and then that'll sustain you through May. Then you go on a mission trip, a conference event, etc., and that'll take you through the summer. I mean, just be thinking about these increments when you got to develop and deliver these 17 hours. Once you start doing that pattern, they're amazing. When we go everywhere, anywhere, I'm a volunteer, Central Presbyterian Church Atlanta. When we go anywhere, you ask questions about, what about those who can't come, because they can't be there for the whole time? I get it. And so I take from Joshua's story, right? Remember? They're crossing over the Jordan. The Lord says to Joshua, get a bunch of the elders to take a stone out of the bottom of the Jordan. Cross over and do what? Build an altar. So in the years to come, people see those stones, they're going to ask, what do those stones mean? After each of our big 3 events, the fall event, the winter event, and the summer event, literally we bring back stones. We've got stones, piles of stones in our room, okay, wherever we meet. And visitors come, new friends come. There's a bunch of rocks in the middle of your room. I know. Why do you have rocks in the middle of your room? Oh, it's pretty cool. Those rocks over there, that represents when we went to Kansas. And we did this whole thing. It was really, really hot. And we did this whole group mission trip for a whole week. We had to work hard to find stones in Kansas, but we found some. And they tell stories about it. And the young person's like, oh, cool. What about those stones? Oh, those stones come from Guatemala. That was a bunch of years ago. I wasn't there, but I heard about it. And they tell about that story. So we've got these reminders, physical reminders. The Bible gives us these patterns, these rituals, to help bring people into the groupness. Does that make sense, Chris? Okay, please.
Could you reflect a little bit on how this generation that apparently has this need for community is also often referred to as the Facebook? What is going on?
Nice. Tell us your name. Daryl Nelson. What a good Lutheran name. Daryl Nelson asks a really, really fine question about how this group generation that's yearning for community is also being called the Facebook generation. There's a lot of research being done right now about social networking and the power of social networking. What's showing up right now, and it's too new to be honest with you, but what's showing up right now, 70 to 80% of communication is nonverbal. 70 to 80% of communication is nonverbal. So I get Skype. In fact, I teach a number of courses on Skype. I do a number of I just finished a whole series of Wednesday night church classes on Skype. So I was there in my office in Atlanta, and I was connected to churches throughout Florida and Alabama and Tennessee, etc. So I get that. And they can see me, and they can see some of my facial features. I can see some of them when they're scanning. But it's not the same. We're missing out on a whole lot of communication. What Facebook does, social networking, texting, etc., it provides a medium of immediate communication, but apparently, this is the research, it's not sustaining communication. So apparently, as like blogs, etc., there are billions of blogs, but I was reading this, less than 0.02% of blogs are actually being read on a regular basis. The vast majority of people think it's a nice idea, but nobody actually follows them. Last century, Jim Naisbitt wrote this book, Megatrends. He said with the rise of high technology, do you remember this? Is going to come the rise of high touch. With the rise of high tech is going to come the rise of high touch. That makes me excited because I'm thinking that's an opening for the church. We can do high touch. People, what does that mean? Chris asks. This is how it's being manifested. Ooh, she left. I'm over here, and behind me, this young woman who I don't know her name, she's a guitarist, Cheryl, she was knitting. There's a cluster of seminary students at Columbia. Our average age, we're young. Our average age for the entering class, we admitted 72 students into the MDiv program this past fall, and the average age was 26, which is really kind of spooky. But anyway, there's a whole cluster of them who have picked up knitting because one of our homiletics professors, preaching professors, knits. And I'll tell you, and they gifted me with a prayer shawl. It is one of the ugliest pieces of craft I've ever seen in my whole life. I mean, it is ugly, okay? But my students know that every morning I light a candle, and I take that prayer shawl and wrap it around me, and I pray through my class lists. My students know that, okay? I was in San Francisco preaching at one of our churches, and the young adult group, 23-something, said, we're going to take you to this really hot restaurant. I'm like, okay, cool. I'm looking forward to good food. I mean, that'd be fun. We went to a place called Home. There's a line out the door, okay? I go in, we finally get in after an hour and a half of waiting. I look at the menu. What do they serve? Meatloaf and mashed potatoes. What? Macaroni and cheese. What? Apple pies, turkey and dressing. And of course, it's San Francisco, so it's $87 turkey and dressing, okay? And I'm looking at, and the place is packed with 20 and 30-somethings, with all kinds of piercings and all kinds of tats, all kinds of hair color, etc. I'm looking around thinking, you people never had these foods growing up. But it's their concept. It's yearning for what home is supposed to be like, all right? So I'm doing this, hey, what is this? The session's finished now, right? No. 5 o'clock? So I'm doing this focus group in Des Moines, Iowa, right? And about 17 young adults, 15 of whom are not in any churches. No Lutheran, Presbyterian, Methodist. We baptize them, confirm them, but they're not staying with us. There's a couple that's still with us. Okay, and I'm like, interesting, weird. They're Presbyterians. And so I pull them aside after the focus group is over, and I ask them, what the heck are you people doing in a church still? And they told me this. They said that they graduated from Rutgers University in New Jersey. They got headhunted. They fell in love and got married. They got headhunted, which I didn't know the term. You know, there are firms in the Midwest. Midwest is losing population. So they send people out to the coasts to get people to come. So they were recruited to come to Iowa. And they thought, well, we don't know anybody in Iowa. We're young. Left their families behind. Their families thought they were crazy in New Jersey. Like, why are you going to Iowa? They're like, well, we just thought we'd try it. They bought a house, which they never could have bought in northern New Jersey. They liked their work. They went to a few churches. A couple times they went to a Presbyterian church. They didn't sign the friendship pad. They're not stupid. But they pretty much on Sundays they were doing what? Sleeping in, having good coffee, reading the paper, New York Times, etc. I mean, just having a nice day, okay? Young woman, their 4th year there, she does a quick self-breast exam. No history of breast cancer. Quick self-breast exam, feels a lump. Calls her mom right away, New Jersey, at her office, who's working. Because she's 20-something, and her mom's, 56, 57. Mom says, oh, sweetheart, I'm sure it's just a cyst. There's no history, not a problem. But you should get it checked out. So she calls her doctor, she told me this, and her doctor says, oh, just come by. Like, well, when's the next appointment? No, just come by. And she's like, this never would happen in New Jersey. So on her break, she swings by her doctor's office, and the physician sees her and says, I don't mean to alarm you, but this is worth looking at. She's like, oh, okay. Calls her husband at his work and says, I'm supposed to go, she referred me to somebody. He goes, oh, sweetheart, I'm sure it's just and yeah, no history, etc. Next week, she goes to this specialist, and he says, I don't mean to alarm you, but this is worth looking at. I want to do a biopsy. Her mother flies out from New Jersey, and her dad is back there working. Her sister flies out as well. She gets the test results back. She has a stage 4 cancer, okay? Already has metastasized into her lymph nodes, okay? She's just shocked and horrified and frightened. Go through surgery. When they get to the hospital, they write down the name of this one church they've been to a couple times, but didn't meet anybody. They just came in last minute, worshipped. It was okay. A bunch of old white people, and they left. Okay? Like, interesting. But they put down this one church. The pastor came, bam, that afternoon. I'm so grateful for him. Showed up, introduced himself, and to the family, etc. And they're like, oh, good to meet you, and prayed with them. And that was so comforting. He was there almost every single day. Okay? She goes home, has begun a rigorous, aggressive chemo and radiation therapy. She's lying down, husband drops her off. She realizes at that point her mother, father, her mother-in-law, father-in-law, her girlfriend, her brother, sister-in-law, her sister, brother, everyone's used up all their time. And they're all working in New Jersey, so they use up all their time. And they're trying to coordinate schedules. So this is the first time she's alone since all this has happened. Husband's at work. And she's lying there, and she says, I realized for the first time, this is why people need to be near family. And she thought, I think we need to move back to New Jersey as soon as I can. I'm leaving Iowa. We're going back to New Jersey. Knock on the door. There's a woman. She ignores it. Knock is persistent. She comes downstairs. There's a woman there. Short, gray hair, with a bag, and says, hello. And she goes, hi, are you? And yeah, I am. Who are you? Well, I'm from church. What church? I'm from, and she names the church, and she names the pastor. And the young woman says, oh, yeah, well, we know him. She goes, yeah, that's the church. And I made a casserole for you, and I baked some fresh rolls, and there's some dessert. It's for us? Yeah. How much is it? And she said, well, it's free. We've been praying for you every single day, you and your husband both, since we heard about this. She said, do you want to come in? And the woman said, well, do you feel up to it? And I said, yeah, actually, I'd like some company. So they go into the living room, they talk, they pray together, they cry some, okay? They find each other's stories. She starts to get tired and says, I think I need to go lie down. And the woman says, yeah, I should leave you alone. But sweetheart, I don't mean to be rude, but I'm looking around, and honey, you need to dust. And the woman says, well, yeah, I haven't had a chance to clean. And she goes, well, would you mind if I stayed and cleaned? You want to do that? And she goes, yeah. So she lies down, the woman stays and cleans up the whole house and leaves. Husband comes home and says, did you clean the house? And she says, no, there's this woman that came from church. What church? Well, the pastor's church. And there's a casserole in the refrigerator and instructions on how to heat it up. Did you make that? No, it came from the woman. How much was it? It was free. Next day, knock on the door, different knock, okay? There's a gentleman there, looking uncomfortable, older adult, 80 years old plus. Hi, are you? Yes, sir. Who are you? And he introduces himself and says, I'm from church. And she goes, you are? And he goes, yes, and this is a chicken dinner. And it's not quite finished, but there's instructions on how to finish it so it's hot. And you can't mess this up or I will get into big trouble. And she said, do you want to come in? And he said, no, I really don't. But I noticed that your screen door isn't working very well. And she said, I know, my husband's going to get to that. And he said, oh, yeah, but young guys don't do this stuff very well. He said, you know, I've got my tools in the car. This won't take 5 minutes. So she puts the chicken dinner in the refrigerator, goes upstairs and lies down. Husband comes home, says, did you fix the screen door? And she says, no. This congregation, which I've met them. There are 120 members, mostly in their 70s and 80s. They provided a different meal for this couple for 6 months. She told me that night, tears streaming down her face. She said, I've already told my family in New Jersey, whether I live for 6 more weeks or 6 more years, or God willing, 60 more years, I'm never leaving this church. I'm going to die in Des Moines, Iowa. Her husband turned to me and he said, we have frozen casseroles until Jesus comes again. He said, we have never eaten so good in our whole lives. I've since learned they have joined that church. They have introduced people with whom they work to this church, mostly around food. They said, we're having a potluck, a covered dish supper. You got to come. These people can make food. And so they've got coworkers coming. Now there's a cadre of about 11 young adults. And about 100, they're dying, so about 107, 70 and 80-year-olds. The pastor of the church, he told me it has transformed their congregation. Because about 107 members of older adults and now 11 young adults, they're getting to be 10%. It's a critical mass. It's changing the whole church. That's high touch. We can do that. That's what we do when people are in crisis. In the midst of this Facebook generation, there is a yearning for this kind of connection. That's what we do. At our very best. At our worst, we do stupid stuff. But at our best, when we shine, I would rather be with no other people on the face of the earth. Because we witness to life in Jesus Christ. That's what we do. Please. Oh, great question. What difference have I noticed within millennial group by culture? I want to parse culture in a whole series of variety of ways. Among young adults so I'm going to do US culture versus global culture beyond. Although clearly, because of Facebooking, et cetera, the demarcation among this generation between what is international and national, it isn't seen the same. They're seeing boundaries in whole nother ways. The boundary issues, interestingly enough, for millennials are more about class than they are about region or race or ethnicity. In that, African American young people who have advanced degrees have more in common with Anglo young people, Asian young people, Hispanic young people, et cetera, Latina, with advanced degrees than they do with their own African American counterparts who have lesser degrees. The issue is about class, okay? Here's the problem for Lutherans. You are one of the highest educated churches in the United States. You have a ton of degrees in your pews. There is a direct correlation between childbirth and education. The more educated you are, the fewer children you have. You're not dying, you're not losing members because people hate being Lutheran. Okay, you're dying, you're losing members because you're literally dying. And you aren't replacing yourselves. Okay? We are at the point now of the oldest among those who are educated, whether they're African, Asian, Hispanic, Latino, Latina, European heritage. We're at the oldest point of marriage in this country, childbearing in this country among educated persons. So to answer you, what I would say is I'm seeing more difference between class than I am about race, ethnicity, and region, and even gender issues, et cetera. Does that make sense? I'm seeing a shrinking of the worldview as well, because technology allows them to sense where the world is. There's a lot of study right now. I just read a really phenomenal PhD dissertation talking about, and this is so fast, I was so impressed with the research, about the spread of revolution in Egypt, Tahrir Square, et cetera, using the Facebook technology and tweeting. That what happened in Tahrir Square was instantaneously sent out in the entire world. Every single major social movement of change, for ill or for goodwill, has been started by young adults in modern times. Every single major social movement, for ill or for goodwill. So even suicide bombers, these are teenagers, young adults, going into cafes, on buses, et cetera. And those who are pushing for freedom from oppressive regimes, these are teenagers and young adults. Their ability to communicate that way, and that's part of the Facebooking issue, is greatly powerful. I want to be clear, I'm not seeing a dismissal of race and ethnicity. What I am seeing is this marvelous sense that people recognize and see difference, but it doesn't totalize or essentialize everyone around them. It isn't homogenization. It isn't the melting pot theory, which is ridiculous. It's I see you as an African American woman, but I'm not presuming that that totalizes or essentializes you. Does that make sense? I see you as different, which is a gift, and I yearn to understand and know how I can stand with you in solidarity in that difference. That's a whole different worldview. I do want to say, and this is tough stuff, and there are people of faith on all the issues, and I know issues of gay and lesbian ordination, et cetera, are a challenge for you as they are for my own tradition. Whether I was in Greenville, South Carolina, Dallas, Fort Worth, Texas, Birmingham, Alabama, some of the buckles of the Bible Belt, I kept on asking 20, 30-somethings, so what about gay and lesbian people, bisexual, transgendered, et cetera? And golly, what showed up in the research really stunned me, that by and large, they see sexual orientation as a non-issue, because they're growing up with people who, he's black, she's Asian, he's gay, she's straight. What? I mean, they just, what? And so one of my church history professors at McCormick Seminary, Ken Sawyer, who I think is brilliant, he calls these sacrifices. As the church engages in our sacrifice, which we Presbyterians are right in the midst of, I worry that it makes us look even more out of touch, irrelevant, old and stodgy. Like, really? You're fighting over that? Really? There are people who really need help, and you're fighting over that? Really? I mean, they're just like, okay. And this was among conservatives, self-identified conservatives and evangelicals in my sampling, as well as among liberals and progressives. It just showed up as a non-issue, which was fascinating to me.
Talk about how class is different. I mean, you started out by saying.
Yeah. Your name? Jane. Jane asked about how I saw class as different. Yeah, so for me, it was clear to me that that's the great divide among the generation. Among young adults, it's the haves and the have-nots. And the have-nots are very, very clear that they have less than the haves. That's the great challenge. As the ELCA, you're also not only one of the oldest, one of the highest educated, you're also one of the wealthiest per capita denominations in the United States. And yeah, there was something somebody said, it'd be easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Oh, but he was talking about the eye of a gate in Jerusalem. And if you contort the camel, actually a camel can get through. If you dismember him correctly, then he can take his nose goes first and then leg, etc. So it's not impossible. Anyway, so the class stuff showed up as huge. And that is it's the have and the have-nots. In this recession period, the gap is even wider, and it's dramatic. That's the piece that we're having a hard time getting a hold of. The assumption that there's a young adult available, church meetings that can come on give up a Friday to show up at a synod assembly, that presumes some sense of privilege. I mean, it has to. It just does. That you're presuming this person can actually give up some time and come here and be a part of an assembly. That's why I'm so grateful for the presence of young adults and young people who are here. But the reality is, that's a class issue in and of itself. So, does that help? Jane, thank you. Please. Ooh, gosh, Thelma. Okay, it's time to go. So you need to take a break. And golly, that's brilliant. Thelma asked, let me paraphrase and see if I get it right. Thelma asks, I want to get this because Bob's asking me to repeat questions. A conversation about the 21st century church and the first century church, how they have more in common, and under the theme of reconciliation. I think that's a brilliant and phenomenal question. I'll talk about this in the morning during my quick hour with you when I do the trends. But the reason I'm arguing that the first century church and the 21st century church has more in common with itself is, for instance, if you look at the context of the first century church, the persecutions hadn't started yet, right? You get that, okay? Because the Christian church was seen as no consequence. I mean, these people were just little weirdos, right? The culture was indifferent, but not hostile. I get Stephen Carter and others, culture disbelief, etc. I get that. But the culture, in my read of the culture, they're not hostile toward us. They're indifferent toward us. We just are like doing our own little things. And they're like, okay, whatever. The place where it really gets interesting. So Bishop Desmond Tutu was in residence. He's now back in South Africa, but he was in residence at Emory University, which is about 15 minutes away, Candler School of Theology at Methodist School, from Columbia's campus. And I was privileged to have a series of meetings with him. There are a bunch of us academics who were sitting with the Archbishop, and we were talking about this. He, of course, launched the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and his phenomenal book is No Future Without Reconciliation. But for the Archbishop, the issue of justice was framed as a reconciliative one, not a retributive one. So when all people had to do, white South Africans, was stand and confess and apologize, even killing black South Africans. And then they were to be set free. You can imagine this was hugely controversial, but the Archbishop led that whole conversation. Desmond, I call him Desmond because he is very kind and lets me do that. I kept on calling him Archbishop, and he would always say, he has this really weird squeaky voice. Oh, he also loves Cheetos. So if you ever see him, really, whenever I would see him, he would say, Rodger, did you bring those poofy, cheesy things that get on my finger? Did you bring it? No, Archbishop. Oh. I like those. They make your fingertips orange. Bring next time. Thank you, Archbishop. I will. I'm like, okay. Nobel Prize winner. Okay. His issue was, if we don't reconcile ourselves one to another, as the Lord has called us to, then we cannot move. He argues that, and this is in the midst of Osama bin Laden's assassination, he argues that reconciliation doesn't mean retribution. It means that we stand with one another confessing. He's very careful with the term forgiveness as well, but he argues that that is the great task and the witness of the Christian community for the 21st century. So as you look at the first century church, biblical theologians talk about the whole Acts of the Apostles is the gospel on the move, right? You get that? Starts where? Jerusalem, Pentecost, goes to Samaria, on the road eventually to Damascus. That's where conversion happens to Saul, becomes Paul, etc. Goes to an Ethiopian eunuch on his way out, etc. I mean, that's where we get the Church of Euchanemesus, one of our oldest, the Coptic Church, etc. I mean, so all this movement is taking place. It's the gospel on the move. The first time it goes to people like you and me who are Gentiles, those of us who are not of Jewish tradition, some of us are, but those of us who are not, is when Peter, right, visits Cornelius and has this vision of the sheet coming down, okay, sees barbecue at least 3 times, right? Pork barbecue, I'm from Georgia, right? Okay, not from Texas, where they think it's beef, they're wrong, okay? Pork barbecue, and Lord, nothing unclean will ever touch these lips, etc. And the Lord's trying to send a message, okay? Desmond argues, the Archbishop argues, that the whole point of Acts of the Apostles is the gospel on the move. It's the gospel starting in Jerusalem and going out. And if you remember, Peter says, how can I withhold the waters of baptism from those who have received the Holy Spirit just as we did, as we have? How can I withhold the waters of baptism from those who have received the Holy Spirit just as I have? That's where he's pushing us. So I'll end with this. I want you to know how grateful I am. Bishop sent me her sermon and talked about your conversation with the Mennonites, which I'm very grateful for. I know it's 500 years, I get that. Peter Oakes teaches ethics at University of Virginia. He's phenomenal, Jewish scholar and brilliant. I was talking to him about this, and Dr. Oakes, he was saying, you know, Rodger, I didn't experience the Shoah, Hebrew for Holocaust. He said, I experienced the Holocaust. I didn't. He's too young. He said, my mother didn't either, but it was in my grandmother's milk. And my mother ingested that milk. And that calcium formed into her bones. And it was in my mother's milk. I ingested that milk. And that formed into my bones. He said, the Holocaust, the Shoah, is in my bones. In 1941, the Empire of Japan did a horrible thing. Bombed Pearl Harbor, attacked our country. In 1942, I would argue, a misguided President Roosevelt did a horrible thing as well. He interned my mother and my father and my grandparents, who were US citizens, as Japanese Americans. My mother was 9, living with my grandparents in Vacaville, California. My father was 8, living in Long Beach, California. They were shown by the government some lovely desert property in Arizona for about 4.5 years. Lost everything. In 1976, Gerald Ford signed an executive order that canceled the executive order in 1942. It lasted that long. And then President Reagan signed a Civil Rights Act that apologized to the Japanese Americans and promised reparations, which came 7 years later. I said to my mom and dad, you know, you were little kids. How does this feel? And my father, who's very stoic, Japanese, very stoic, sort of like Lutherans, very stoic. I've only seen him cry twice in my life. Turned to me and started crying and said, it felt like a resurrection. I said, Dad, you were a little kid. And he goes, Rodger, it's in my bones, and it's in your bones. So I get this is 500 years of history. I get that. But friends, this is in our bones. This is in our bones. So when I hear folks say, you know, I don't own slaves, you know, this is, you know, a whole conversation of reparations for African Americans. Friends, it is in our bones. I teach at Columbia Seminary in the heart of Atlanta. Our buildings were built by African American women and men. They structured our buildings for us, and they were not compensated. It's in our bones. The task of reconciliation, Thelma, you know this, it's lifelong and generational. It's in our bones. So, thank you. Thanks for a conversation. Hey. Go.